Aditi Angiras is a poet and artist based in New Delhi. She is the founder of Bring Back the Poets, a queer collective of poets and performers from South Asia. Akhil Katyal is a writer based in Delhi as well. He is the author of How Many Countries Does the Indus Cross? And Like Blood and the Bitten Tongue, Delhi Poems. Together, Aditi and Akhil have co-edited The World That Belongs to Us, an anthology of queer poetry from South Asia by HarperCollins India, and now we have the great pleasure of hearing them in conversation.
Thank you, Lena. Aditi and I edited this book called The World That Belongs to Us, an anthology of queer poetry from South Asia, and our conversation today will largely be anchored in this book. This book came out around mid-2020. So it's been a few years, and the book has traveled and circulated and has initiated some conversation, some of which we will be sharing with you today. Both the process and the thinking that went into making such a book, and some of the questions that emerged and remain unresolved for us even at this stage. Aditi and I both are poets based in this city for the last decade or two. Maybe we can start with Aditi reading a poem from the collection for us, and then thinking about this slightly juggernaut of a question for us, because we were always, now that we were editing an anthology, we were asked to define, think at least tentatively about what a queer poem is. So maybe she'll read a poem and get us started thinking on that line, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you. Thanks, Akhil. I'll begin by reading a poem by Fatima Asghar. Fatima is the author of the poetry collection If They Come For Us, 2018, and the chapbook After 2015. She is also the writer and co-creator of the Emmy-nominated web series Brown Girls. So the poem I'm reading is called Pluto Shits on the Universe. On 7th February 1979, Pluto crossed over Neptune's orbit and became the 8th planet from the Sun for 20 years. A study in 1988 determined that Pluto's path of the orbit could never be accurately predicted. Labeled as chaotic, Pluto was later discredited from planet status in 2006. And the poem begins. Today, I broke your solar system. Oops, my bad. Your graph said I was supposed to make a nice little loop around the sun. Nah. I chaos like a motherfucker. Ain't no one can chart me. All the other planets, they think I'm annoying. They think I'm an escaped moon running free. Fuck your moon, fuck your solar system, fuck your time, your ear. Your ear ain't shit but a day to me. I could spend your whole year turning the winds in my bed, thinking about rings and how Jupiter should just pussy on up and marry me by now. Your day, that's an asswipe, a sniffle. Your whole day is barely the start of my sunset. My name means hell, bitch. I am hell, bitch. All the cold you are yet to feel, chaos like a motherfucker. And you tried to order me, call me a ninth. Somewhere in the mess of graphs and maths and compass, you tried to make me follow rules. Rules. Fuck your rules. Neptune, that bitch slow. And I deserve all the sun I can get and all the blue gold sky I want around me. It is February 7th, 1979, and my skin is more copper than any sky ever will be. More metal. Neptune is bitch sobbing in my rear view, and I got my running shoes on and all the sky, that's all mine. Fuck your order, fuck your time, I realigned the cosmos. I chaosed all the hell you have yet to feel. Now all your kids in the classroom, they're confused. All the clocks wrong. They don't even know what the fuck to do. They gotta memorize new songs and shit, and all the other planets, I fucked their orbits. I shook the sky, chaos like a motherfucker. It is February 7th, 1979. The sky is blue gold, the possibility, the freedom of possibility. Today, I broke your solar system. Oops, my bad. So this poem by Fatima, I've read this before at whenever we sit down to discuss this book as well, because it's really interesting. And whenever we think of the question, what is a queer poem, I think now my answer, after having worked with Akhil on it for a while, is that everything that exists in the world that belongs to us, and in case of Fatima, also the entire universe, is what qualifies as a queer poem. I think when we sent out the call for submissions, for the book, it was translated into multiple languages as well. And that is when the first discussion about what kind of poems should we shortlist, which kind of poets are we looking for, because there were a lot of questions, I think, around that time that people were asking, do you need to identify as a queer person to be able to write a queer poem? Or the question that if the poem itself is not in particularly, I think, speaking about sex or sexuality or your gender identity, and it's not navigating the politics of gender or sexuality, does it still qualify as a queer poem? Because I think a lot of times everybody's expectation is that a gay poem has to be about something very vehemently gay in that sense. But if you've gone through the anthology, there are poems about cooking food together, about getting haircuts, about attending your father's funeral, and very intimate, very human, very normal, so to say, things. And in that normality, I think each of them qualified in some sense as a queer poem. We were also discussing once about the gaydar, if we can use the gaydar to be able to identify a queer poem, and I think we sort of felt it. And I say that that gaydar, I think, of being able to read a poem and understand, is it touching us the way that we think it'll touch our audience or readers as well? If that's what the poem made us feel, in how honest and vulnerable some of these poems were, or how angry, like we have a poem called The Resistance Rap, which is about a lot more, and not, and talking about the fact that the personal is political, of course, but in a larger sense of thing, all the world politics is also very personal. So any poem, I think, when we were reading through it, it was able to shed some light on some of the things that you and me, and between us and the other translators and editors that we were working with, they were about to touch that nerve. I think for us that became a queer poem. What do you think, Akhil?
From the stage of conceptualizing this book, thinking about what its outer boundary might be, if any, to then really struggling with this question of what constitutes a queer poem, one of the things that became evident to us early on is that our contributors had a very complex, had a very tricky, very slippery relationship with identity categories, identity names. One thing that you might notice if you pick up this book is all the bios of the authors are written by themselves. And some folks actually, in that sense qualify as like card-carrying queers. Like they've named themselves, they've named the identity category, they've proudly owned it. There are others who have actually eschewed identity category altogether. They've highlighted other aspects of themselves. So just thinking about that, this kind of sign of the name, which in a sense, the cover will carry, but the inside of the book never quite has the confidence of its cover page. The inside of the book tells stories which are not quite contained within the guiding conceit of the cover page. So what became interesting to us, that in a sense that even this book, which was published in 2020, is rehearsing some of the complexities that queer desires held in the subcontinent for a long time. I've been reading, English and in Hindi and Urdu queer literature from across the 20th century for a while. And if you notice some of the maneuvers that Hindi and Urdu literature brings in order to bring same-sex desire into play, in order to bring same-sex desire into its pages, it doesn't do it through the name, it doesn't do it through the identity category, it doesn't do it through certain words which make you into a certain person depending on who you love. So if I love men, I am gay, or if I love women, I am straight. That connection is not made when same-sex desire is invoked in lots of Hindi and Urdu texts. I was remembering, I was an English literature student, and now I'm a creative writing teacher at Ambedkar University in Delhi. And one of the stories that becomes a cornerstone of any English literature syllabi in translation is Isma Chuktai's Lihaf, which sort of introduced into conversations of same-sex desire as undergraduate students and continues to do for the present generation as well. And I was reading around, I was reading her autobiography, I was reading some of her interviews. And in 1940, when the story gets written, when it is Ismat Chuktai's Urdu short story Lihaf, which is about a relationship between this figure of the Begum and Rabbu, the person who works at her place, when the story got written and when it was pulled into an obscenity case in Lahore of the time, colonial court, Isma Chuktai lands up in Lahore with Saadat Hasan Manto, and she's fighting this obscenity case, and she's having this conversation with another Urdu writer called M. Aslam. And I'll just quote what she tells him, and it's indicative of that actually you've not quite settled in how to think about the subject of same-sex desire. The jury is still out. It's up for grabs. So she's saying, M. Aslam is telling her, why did you write this story? It's created such controversy. In fact, it became a sort of curse of sorts. Isma Chuktai herself came to resent the story because she became almost synonymous with the story. So she tells Aslam Sahab कि Aslam Sahab मुझे नहीं मालूम था कि लिहाफ वाले मौजू पर लिखना मना है. मुझे नहीं मालूम था इस मर्ज या लत पर लिखना मना है. मेरा दिमाग तो अब्दुल रहमान चुक्ते का कैमरा है, खट से बटन दब जाता है और जो भी मेरे सामने है उसकी तस्वीर खिंच जाती है in a sense. So what she's saying, I never knew that. So thing is not named. It's called the Lihaf Wala Mawzu. The subject of Lihaf itself remains unnamed. And then she says, मुझे नहीं मालूम था कि इस मर्ज, illness, medical condition, she's not quite sure because we should know that Isma Chukta is also a reader of Havelock Ellis and Sigmund Freud in her libraries in Bareilly and Isabella Thoburn College in Lucknow. She's reading this literature. Uski dimag kalabaziya kha raha hai when she's reading this European archive. And yet she says, yes, mars, but she also invokes like a social idiom, lat, shock, bazi, a kind of interest which has not quite become addiction, a kind of hobby which is not quite medicalizable. And the ellipses in the text are her own. They're not introduced by later editions. So the confusion is fundamental to the way she was even thinking about same-sex desire. And I think in some sense that confusion, not a prohibitive one, but a kind of open-endedness remains with how same-sex desire gets played out on ground, in the lives of people, in the actions of people, in the desires of people, in the living choices of people. That the name is only one dimension through which same-sex desire comes into being. So then the struggle in this book became, we are not only looking for folks who self-identify as certain named categories. So how do you deal with that in an English anthology? We sort of did, in a sense, our response to this was a strategy of excess. So when the call first went out, I just quote one small line from it. Then the call went out. We said we invited entries from trans men, trans women, lesbian, hijra, kothi, gay, aravani, khwaja sara, intersex, jogappa, bisexual, drag king, queen, genderqueer, non-binary, male, chele, butch, femme, and other poets, thinking that this idea of excess will both acknowledge how name plays a very crucial role in people's self-identification, but also it would not limit them to only that marker. And when this call actually went out, immediately it was taken up by several people and they said, but wait a minute, asexual is missing from this, pansexual is missing from this. Ramki, the activist from Chennai, they said the category which is very useful in Manipur for lots of folks, Nupi Manbi and Nupa Manba is missing from this, which ultimately we introduced and poets have written under that name as well. Tirunangai, the Tamil category was missing from this. So in a sense, we resolved this question of queerness, and queerness then became a kind of a convenient signpost for all these categories, rather than something which has a dense, concrete kind of evidence.
And I think we discussed, and after the call for submissions actually went out, I think it became interesting to also remember how the little line that appears as the subtitle of the book, a queer anthology. I think our comfort, or our growing comfort or lack of comfort, I think, with the word queer because the question of should we just go ahead and call it LGBT, IQ plus, but then again, is that plus really all inclusive? And specifically when we are putting together a book on South Asia and with South Asian poets, I think it became more complicated because again, this term, and I think you might want to talk about it or read something for the, from the book as well, is about the fact that quite a lot of them might or might not necessarily even identify with this acronym or feel that they're a part of it, like the conversation, about including different categories. And then for us also, at least for me, it was a learning experience to also understand that even while we are working in the space of queer activism, we are talking about poetry, we're talking about queer poetry, but where does it stop? I think it stops, you take 2 steps forward and then there's a long way to be really inclusive. And I think that's what we try to do with the book. And then the other question of language and translation, if you'd like to speak about, because I think the scope of the book kept expanding, and it was inclusive in that sense.
There's one of the things that we found out that even this book, which was very comfortable with the largely mid 20th or late 20th century onwards vocabulary of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. However, in the way that people were writing and in the way people were indexing the experiences, all those kind of older slippages between names and people's lives were still alive. And one of my favorite books as a kind of young postgraduate student was this. Yoda Press had just come out in 2005, if I'm not mistaken, by this book called Maya Sharma, who's based in Baroda, called Loving Women, Being Lesbian in Unprivileged India. And it largely included interviews of women and present both gender conforming, gender non-conforming, in Gujarat, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and she did a series of, if I'm not mistaken, around 14 to 15 interviews with them, and the book was kind of an ethnographic account of those interviews. And what was really interesting was, she said one of the primary categories through which these women make sense of themselves and in their togetherness with each other and in the intimacy that they barter with each other is through the framework, the idiom of friendship. So the word that she constantly heard was Sakhi, Saheli, Sathin, Dost, and 2 folks were also using the word lesbian, etc. But in each case, what was implicated was desire, erotic, desire, affective, desire of bodies and minds, and where they thought of the other person as significant contributor in their lives. And what was evident for us is that the friendship itself as an idiom was a very expansive one. It included the erotic rather than necessarily excluding it. A, and B, that the idiom of friendship and the idiom of, let's say, lesbian, or someone who would call someone not just a dost but a partner, it had like peculiar slippages between it. In a sense that friendship, although a very kind of open-ended concept, allowing these women to self-represent themselves as each other's friends in the society that they were living in, nonetheless had some limitations in the sense that the idea of friendship was that एक हद के बाद नहीं और एक समय के बाद नहीं. In a sense that at some point you have to outlive your friendship to get into institutional mandate of marriage. And at some point your friendship should not cross a threshold of a certain intensity, affective or bodily. And these women, even as they were using the idiom of friendship, were struggling with this, outliving it and outsmarting it in a sense. And one of the poems, I think I want to read the poem of this Punjabi poet, Simple Rajra. And the book, while recognizing this expansive definition of friendship, was able to include this poem because this is a story which she told us that was based on her Nani's story of being now separated from a close friend of hers who now ends up on the Pakistani side of the border, and she remains in Jammu, if I'm not mistaken. So I want to read the Punjabi version and I'll read the English translation by Jasdeep. The poem is called Kharidari. Simple Rajra. ऐ की है बर्फ, मैं नंगे पैर दौड़ तो प्यासी, आखिर दिन मिलन नहीं आई, ऐना तड़पी मैं, लिया एक सिल्ली, ਲਿਆ ਇੱਕ ਸਿੱਲੀ ਮੇਰੇ ਰੂਹ ਤੇ ਰੱਖ ਦੇ। ਇਹ ਕੀ ਹੈ? ਰੇਤ। ਮੈਂ ਕੋਈ ਮਕਬਰਾ ਨਹੀਂ, ਛੋਟੇ ਕੰਕਰ ਨਾਲ ਮੇਰਾ ਕੀ ਕੰਮ। ਹਾਂ ਲੇਕਿਨ ਲਾਸ਼ ਹੈ ਉਸ ਦੀ ਖੁਆਇਸ਼ਾਂ ਦੀ, ਲਿਆ ਇੱਕ ਬੋਰੀ ਪਾ ਦੇ। ਇਹ ਕੀ ਹੈ? ਲੂਣ। ਰੱਤੋਵਾਲ ਤੂੰ ਨਵਾਂ ਸ਼ਹਿਰ ਨਾਟ ਪਈ ਤੇ ਵੇਚਿਆ ਸੀ, ਜੇ ਉਈਓ ਸੇਲੀ ਕੋਲੋਂ ਲਿਆਵੇ ਤੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਮੂੰਹ ਵਿੱਚ ਰੱਖ ਦੇ। ਇਹ ਕੀ ਹੈ? ਮੀਂਹ। ਮੁਸਲਮਾਨਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਘਰ ਲਿਆ ਸੀ, ਪਿੱਛੇ ਪੀਰਾ ਦੀ ਜਗ੍ਹਾ ਦੀ ਢਾਈ, ਜੇ ਉਸੇ ਮਜ਼ਾਰ ਤੋਂ ਚੁੱਕਿਆ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਮੇਰੀ ਛਾਤੀ ਨਾਲ ਲਾ ਦੇ। ਇਹ ਕੀ ਹੈ? ਤੁੰਡਾ। ਲਾਹੌਰ ਦੀਆਂ ਹੋਂ ਜਾਂ ਜੰਮੂ ਦੀਆਂ, ਅੱਗੇ ਕੁਛ ਨਹੀਂ ਦੱਸਦੀਆਂ, ਜੇ ਉਸਦੇ ਸਿੱਲੇ ਹੱਥਾਂ ਦੀ ਠੰਡ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਬਾਲਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਿਆ ਦੇ। And Jasdeep translates this poem. Kharidari. What do I not buy? What is this? Ice. I ran barefoot, searched like the mad do. Why didn't you come for the last time? I pined beyond measure. Come, put one slab on my soul. What is this? Sand. I'm not a mausoleum. What do I need these tiny pebbles for? Yes, but the corpse of my desires lie there, empty, the full sack on it. What is this? Salt. Traded off when we had to flee from Rattoval, that Punjab, to Nawa Shahar, this Punjab. If you got it from the same woman, put it in my mouth. What is this? Rain. We got the house from the Muslims, but we kept the Peer's shrine in the backyard intact. If the raindrops are washed from the mazar, get them close to my chest. What is this? Fog. Whether from Lahore or Jammu, it won't tell you what lies ahead. If it is the chill from her moist hands, stitch it in my hair. And there is a sense that both Jasdeep and Simple make it evident that you don't have to make ultimately fetishizable or hard distinctions between an idiom of friendship which includes such sensuous images of put it in my mouth and stitch it in my hair, and something which we could now identify easily or conveniently as lesbian. So the book sort of made that range possible. I don't know how we are doing in terms of time, but maybe we could.
Yeah.
Maybe I could ask Aditi also to think about what role does then an anthology like this play in a kind of wider public sphere? Like, what is the public that we sought to create? And because we also meet whenever we come to discuss this book, although we live in the same city, we are actually meeting after a really long time, to get a sense about what do you think the book could have done, has done, and is yet to do in terms of what its initial promise was, and in some measure it might have been realized and some measure it might not have been.
I think before I answer that, there's just like a small question again for you, because Akhil does a lot of translation work as well. And when we were reading this, I think it was very interesting for at least particularly this anthology, was that not only were we working with established poets, we have Vikram Seth and Kazim Ali and a lot of other poets who are at least read or people know about them, but we also wanted the anthology to be able to extend a invitation to first-time poets, which is very strange for an anthology, given my understanding of also studying literature and growing up reading anthologies as definitive books in certain categories. So I think this bit was clear when Akhil and I started working on the anthology, was this anthology is not going to build a canon. It's only going to I think it's just going to break the silence, I think, of which has been there for a while. We both, he teaches creative writing, and I have worked quite a bit with young adults, specifically in the space of spoken word poetry, and I think it was that quite a lot of very radical, very good queer poetry and poetry in general is coming from the younger crowd, and people who probably haven't haven't really thought of themselves as poets or who haven't thought of publishing poetry. But we felt that, these poems also need to be read and translated and shared with people, specifically when we're making this very big claim of sending out poems representing the entirety of South Asia, which is a big claim. So we picked on, I think, very big battles, and we're still thinking about them. It's South Asia. It's not just English poetry. So we spoke about translation as well. So the question that I was thinking about was, again, that we spoke about what queer poetry is. So is a queer poem still a queer poem if by a queer poet, if it has been translated by somebody who doesn't identify as queer? So do you think, or what would you think about poems like those? Because we took a very conscious choice with our translations, but what do you think outside the scope of the anthology?
Uh, uh, Before thinking about that question, in fact, what Aditi was saying regarding this kind of amorphous category called South Asia, which is also like an American think tank foreign policy kind of constituency, the South Asia, where on some days Burma is in it, on some days it is not, on some days Afghanistan is in it, some days it's not. It's really kind of a term of convenience of sorts, and often people don't themselves, in at least several of the contributors, it surprised us that some of them did use South Asian as some form of self-identification or categorization, though overwhelmingly they did not. So the convenience of that term we should recognize. But just, I mean, the material life that the book then has in this amorphous thing called South Asia, the book didn't reach Pakistan, from which we had several contributors for the longest time, which has as much to do with the material routes that publishing has between India and Pakistan, which I'm sure publishers would be better able to speak about. It didn't reach. One of my friends recently was going to Nepal for a kind of seminar between different NGOs, and one of our friends from Pakistan, who's a contributor to this volume, was also coming there. The book finally, it was my author copy, reached Nepal through Sabika and then finally reached Asad through this route. So Nepal has always proven its usefulness to these two big brother saber rattling states, India and Pakistan. And this is the way one book has now reached Pakistan 2 years after the book was first published. So the amorphousness of this category is it's not just a claim, it's a lived material reality between where the book will go and where it won't go. Regarding the translation, it's always we have lots of predecessors. Hoshang Merchant edited in 1999, Yarana Gay Writing from India. Ashwini Sukthankar edited Facing the Mirror, Anthology of Lesbian Writing. Minal Hajratwala did similar anthologies. So there are lots of gestures of anthologizing before us as well. And in fact, I remember reading in Facing the Mirror, which was Ashwini Sukthankar's lesbian writing anthology, and there was a moment in her introduction where she's trying to articulate that how did she go about finding translators, which is a job that we also had to do. And she very specifically said that, one chose queer women, one chose lesbian women as translators for lesbian poets, because there is, in a sense, and I'm paraphrasing, you don't quote me on this, but there's a sense that occupying the same occupying the same kind of erotic persuasion would also then clue them into the music and the nuance of the poem that perhaps non-queer poets would not be able to do. And I was just thinking about that, and that kept on running in my mind, that it is then necessary to be a queer translator for a queer poem, for some form of its kind of primal energy to translate into the poem. And that sort of brought us against a strange sort of obstructions, because if you is then erotic, where is the erotic persuasion located? It's located in the body. So is this kind of bodily similarity the only criteria that the poet and the translator have to share? And what we found out, in fact, was no. I mean, their vision of the world, their outlook of the world, their socio-political grounding in the world was proving to be far more important rather than this kind of shared criteria of erotic persuasion. And we were thinking, I don't know if you know some of these writers, but let's say a Lakshminarayan Tripathi would not be the best translator for a Vikramaditya Sahai poem, despite both of them would be placed within the spectrum of tranceness of some sort. Or a kind of a gay Ambedkarite would not be the best translator of a kind of a gay BJP loyalist, of which now there are several, as we all know. They won't be, despite the fact that they share this kind of quantum of gayness or transness, and yet they come with very different kind of stances towards the world. They have come with very different kinds of journeys in this world. So, and my hunch is Ashwini would agree with us, you know, that in a sense that body is not the only dimension. Then we became interested, and we were also interested in what is the kind of knowledge and ways of thinking and a larger world vision which these translators were coming from. And in fact, Simple Rajra has been translated to the best of my knowledge, by a person who doesn't identify as queer. And yet they share a love for crossing this kind of fault line of religion, healing the religious discord that partition caused. They share that. They don't share erotic persuasion as such, right?
In
So
that sense, like the book is then working fine within this South Asian sense of politics, because all of these, the task of religion, the task of borders. I remember when in the beginning we were really trying, and we were hoping that we were able to receive many submissions, but at least some submissions from Nepal, and on paper and on policy matters and legally, I think the understanding specifically on the other side we have, India was also there in Pakistan, that things would slightly be better there. Maybe it'll be easier for people to respond to a call, identify as queer, come out and share their poems with us. But just finding representation from certain neighboring countries was really difficult. So while South Asia was trying to do what we were trying to do with the book, but just being able to reach out to enough people and people across borders, then this interplay of religion, of politics, and I think a lot of that comes through in a lot of poems in the anthology.
Maybe what we could do, I mean, I think we have spoken quite a fair bit. Yeah. So what we could do, maybe read a poem each, which are our own poems, and then we can draw the discussion to a close. And any question, thought, doubt, prompt that you have in mind, we'd be happy to speak about that. Yeah? Would you want to start? So Aditi and I have one fairly long poem of our own. So these are not from the anthology. These are poems that we've written more recently. But I think they have struck with some of the themes that the anthology also engaged with. This poem is called To Gay Men Who Marry Women. To Gay Men Who Marry Women. I suppose I should not write this with resentment. I suppose you did it because the world was too much weight for you, and each day was a mountain piercing down your shoulder blade. I suppose you made a bargain where you bartered a rib, and the world came rushing in to fit into you like a jigsaw piece. Don't get me wrong. I understand the need for security, and I hope you find that. We all need someone to look out for us while the world is watching our steps. But what I can't imagine is the temerity of giving yourself to a person who does not know you, who will not know you, or will find out the hard way. I can't imagine the temerity of hoping to marry someone who is a quiet, meek sort of a person so that she will not ask the hard questions. We all need someone who will listen to how we spend our days and who takes us for doctor's checkups when we need them. But what an odd script to hold out to someone as a condition. Honestly, I cannot compete with security. People will break their world to be secure in it. I suppose all that you stole from me was a portrait I would have hung on my wall. There is, I am sure, another portrait hanging elsewhere in its stead. I know how important appearances become for, I want to say, you people, but that is true for most of us. Ages ago, a college friend married, and I have never seen anyone share so many honeymoon pictures on their feed. I suppose we all become the small film we show of ourselves to the world. I suppose the neighbors will love you and will not hear the growing hush inside you both. I swear to you, there are days when I ask for your happiness. Otherwise, all this would have been for nothing, and one of us, at any rate, should come out of this relatively unwounded. I suppose you hope you have found someone who will forgive you. I don't know whether she will. For her sake, I hope she does not. But then I suppose you will bring a new life into the world, and that will be your skin in the game, and she will finally, at some point, take pity at how much a person is ready to confound himself for a small shot at respect. I suppose we are all living in a real world with real constraints, and some fantasies become untenable. For your sake, I hope she does answer your fantasy. I hope your world is made up of days which pass. You have stolen 2 futures to make your own. You will carry the robber's guilt while making full use of the loot. I suppose that is how many of us live, letting a thorn grow within us till people can see it in our eyes. I hope someday someone will see it in your eyes and will give you the forgiveness you will need so desperately. To be honest, I am not capable of it yet. I don't know when I will be. Till that moment, I will keep it safely for you with me.
In case there are any comments or questions, and then I can just quickly read my really long poem in the last 5 minutes.
My one question is, could you talk a little bit about the goals that you had of the effect that this anthology, the publication of this anthology would have versus the effects that you have seen? Did it accomplish what you had imagined? Was it different? You discussed a little bit, how like you intended to be really inclusive, and even in all attempts to inclusivity, there's always more, and there's permutations of more and more. So if you could discuss this a little bit, I think I would really love to hear from it, and I'm sure everybody else would benefit.
I think in terms of the goals, the anthology actually came from conversations, and HarperCollins was speaking with Akhil, and Akhil then reached out to me, and then we just met one day in a rickshaw ride, and we were just discussing what is it that we want to do with this anthology. And I think at first it was all the things that we just spoke about, which was to be able to, I think, not give another platform, but give another opportunity, because we were already doing some poetry readings here in Delhi. He was teaching, I was hosting these events. It was to be able to just extend that a little bit, invite new poems and new poets into this space. The life that I think the book now has taken, and which was something that we discussed once, but we really did not think about it, is that to be able to use the anthology in the classroom. And I think to be able to, because there are different identities, I think you can pick out either the queer bit of it, the anthology, or the South Asia. So depending upon what is the curriculum at various colleges looking at, I think a lot from the book, that's the life that the book has taken. It has traveled to universities, it's being taught in classrooms, which was something that I knew that usually anthologies are tasked with, but that was fairly interesting. And also, around the time the book actually came out, what started happening was lots of articles, interviews, readings, specifically within Delhi University and universities in Delhi, newspapers. So I feel first the bravery, I think, and the courage to be able to identify as a poet, and then to be able to come out and identify as a queer poet. And now I meet quite a lot of queer poets when I'm traveling across the country. And I think that was something. Is it that we put the book together and now these are just echoes? Or is it something that maybe when you speak to somebody and they've read the book, or they know of other poets from herein, they're able to say, hi, I am so-and-so, and I am a queer poet. And I think for me, when I see somebody in their teenage or 20s to be able to say that, I think it just makes me really happy.
I mean, a few sort of moments of joy were particularly that, because there are lots of first-time poets as well. There are folks who are very tentatively taking their first steps into what they think queerness is and what they think poetry is. And I think when they held the book with them, they created small publics around them. They took it to their university, to their families. I think that was a fairly joyous moment for us. Obviously, there are lots of sobering and humbling moments as well. We could get, I mean, ultimately, this, although it claims to be a South Asian anthology, there are only English and translations from 10 more languages, which is a small slice of the capacities of languages in terms of the subcontinent. There is one poet, a Tamil poet, who we really wanted, who had serious problems with how much a mainstream publisher was paying them for a poem. From about what I remember, I think what the publisher, who had obviously their own arguments about this being poetry publishing being a very strapped circumstances. I think the payment was about 1,000 rupees per contributor, which is next to nothing, and it was more a token rather than a payment. And that person had very credible points about saying, but we are trying to get a more equitable system in work, and we need contributors to be paid better. And they finally pulled out of the anthology, despite that their poem being we really wishing it to remain there. So that public then was short-circuited. That public then couldn't form, which it could have. And there was a literary estate of a very prominent American poet who we tried to persuade. But the thing about the word queer is that sometimes queer people don't themselves think of themselves as queer at any given moment of time. When you go to vote, you're not thinking of a queer person voting. Or when you're holding a phone and having a conversation, it's not a queer person holding a phone and having a conversation. Queerness becomes relevant at certain stages of your life. It becomes irrelevant at other stages of your life. And yet, queer as a word somehow becomes like a talisman, some kind of marker, some kind of like a boundary marker, which then for this literary estate of this South Asian American poet, then became too much of a kind of drawing of boundaries around that poet and the legacy of that poet. And they said, for a variety of reasons, we cannot let you have it. And what do you do with that phrase? It's a difficult phrase to compete with. For a variety of reasons, we couldn't have him then. So there are very sobering moments as well across the journey of this book. And I think one of the things that we have to ultimately, two English-speaking upper caste poets from Delhi claiming a South Asian anthology itself automatically reproduces so many constraints. What if we had a third editor from another country? What if we had a third editor from other social locations? What if one of us was not there and someone else was there? That is a different anthology, and those gaps are to be filled. Not just gaps to be filled, that terrain has to be reimagined. Not just something that we have done and someone else will fill that job. No, maybe the work will begin in a different manner altogether.
So I'll just read this one. This poem is called That Thing with Feathers. It's a slightly long prose poem, but I'll try my best to not exceed that time. Growing up in specifically about Delhi, a lot of Delhi poets love writing about Delhi, and I've read Akhil's poetry also about Delhi, and the more I was trying to do that, I've been in Delhi only for the last 10, 15 years, and was to be able to use poetry to be able to really explore the city, to be able to really understand what is it that people love about the city, and mostly it's the love about the city that I've read about. This poem also comes from that space. Unearth, opposite of earth, to dig and discover from the depths of darkness to bring to light. It's a phonetic cousin of the Sanskrit word unearth, which means without any meaning. A calamity, a catastrophe, an action so grievously wrong that it renders everything else meaningless, worthless, as if the opposite of earth was not discovery, but senselessness. We've been seeking purpose in the stars and the skies ever since we got here. Discover. From the Latin to mean, to reverse the complete covering of something. When NASA scientists discovered buried lakes under the dry ice surface of Mars, it seemed unworldly, unearthly, but with the potential of being Earth. Like if we could just reach out and scratch the surface deep enough, we might touch on something alive. The dead water is so saline that they would rub salt on our wounds if they could. The water left its birthmark on the planet's skin, a reminder that it once was a twin. Such light years are closer than they appear in the mirror. It would only take one birth cycle to reach there from here. My city is halfway Mars, part-time paradise. Landlocked, landlocked, landlocked land. It's got nowhere to go. We've swallowed the key along with 1,000 lakes, a couple hills, and a river. Now we've got nothing to do and nowhere to go. We switch on our windows and see the world pass by in black and white, pigeons perched on the horizon, paused like ancient statues in a ruin. The sound of sirens fills the street with a pulse every now and then. From the telescope, I look at the drop of blood in the sky, and like an angry eye, it stares back at me. I grab the red pill and wash it down with a blue glass of water. They say that before color began to disappear, Delhi was dreamlike. A disco in the trees, bird songs in the evening light. 2 years after independence, the painted stock began to visit the Purana Killa and started a love affair with the lakes of the city. Come September, the canopy of the city would turn into a canvas of feathers. A winter's ball with guests from around the world, from warblers to dancers, princely names, and every spring shade under the sun. Just to call them by the names would make your throat blush with surprise. Copper-spit barbets, purple sunbirds, red-whiskered bulbul, blue-throat thrush, the greater flamingo, wood sandpiper. Birds, busy globetrotters, their wings carry wireless letters from the future. Time-traveling canaries in this coal mine of a city, now worm-eaten sonnets sing in their beaks. At the airport of today, their flight status reads delayed, cancelled, temporarily suspended. Harbingers of news that our feeble human brains don't yet know how to read. Our ears deaf to the dial tone, no vitally organ to warn us the vitals are dropping low. Soothsayers, who can pick up frequencies mid-air, somersaulting seers whispering truth in the wind. They're leaving us, stranded on this island of buried lakes, obsolete. This subscription is no longer available in your location. Please try again tomorrow. The groundwater is asking us to dig deeper into our souls. Roots are crawling out of concrete pavements to walk us home. Thank you.
Thank you so much.